Let's play a game of soccer. I'm sure you have some idea of how this works, but just so you're familiar, the objective is to kick the ball into the opponent's goal, and when time runs out, the team with the most goals wins the game. Let's say, for example, that we scored 4 goals and the other team scored 3 goals. Did we win, did we lose, or did we tie? Well, we won because we scored more goals than the other team. Let's say instead we're on a hot streak and we score 6 goals, whereas the other team only scores 2. Obviously, we won both times because we scored more goals each time. But which one was the better win? Well, it's got to be the second game because we won by more goals, 4, than when we won 4-3, which was just by 1 goal. In other words, one win was bigger than the other. What we've just calculated was the net goals, the difference between the goals we scored minus the goals the other team scored. As long as we scored more goals than the other team, we not only win the game, but our net goals is also positive. Let's say instead that we have a few players injured and only score 2 goals and the other team scores 3 goals. Did we win, did we lose, or did we tie? Well, we lose. It was a negative outcome because we scored less goals than the other team. Consequently, what would be our net goals for this game that we lost 2-3? Well, since it's goals we scored minus goals they scored, 2 minus 3 equals -1 for our net goals value. Notice how a positive outcome for the game, because we won, has a positive net goals value, whereas a negative outcome for the game, because we lost, has a corresponding negative net goals value. But what if we tie? Would that make net goals positive, negative? What would it be? Well, let's try this out. For our tie, let's say that we score 1 goal and the other team scores 1 goal. That'll give us a net goals value of 0, because any number minus itself is by definition 0. In fact, for that same reason, if we tie, we can only ever get a 0 net goals value. By now, you should have noticed a connection between the outcome of the game for us, in other words, if we won, lost, or tied, with the corresponding net goals value, i.e. whether it was negative, neutral, or positive. In general, we can say that whether or not the outcome of the game, and thus the net goals, was negative, neutral, or positive, is due to the comparison of our goals versus the other team's goals. Let's look at this more closely. I think we can all agree then that a goal for us is positive and a goal for them is negative. In chemistry, we have the subatomic particles: protons, neutrons, and electrons. A proton has a positive 1 charge, and an electron has a negative 1 charge. Therefore, we can use a positive 1 proton to represent a single goal for us, and a negative 1 electron to represent a goal for them. So our 4-3 score from earlier becomes 4 protons and 3 electrons. Consequently, our net goals value of +1 becomes a net charge value, because instead of our goals minus their goals, it's now protons minus electrons. In fact, net charge is the overall charge assigned to an atom, determined by subtracting the number of the atom's protons minus the number of its electrons. Another way of saying this is that subatomic particles have their own charge, and since they compose an atom, the atom itself has a charge, and we call this the overall charge of the atom, net charge. So an atom with 4 protons and 3 electrons would have a net charge of +1. What about an atom with 3 protons and 5 electrons? That's a net charge of -2, because 3 minus 5 is -2. What about 15 protons and 15 electrons? What would be the net charge? Well, since there's an equal number of protons and electrons, that's going to balance out to an overall net charge of 0 for the atom. Therefore, we quantify an atom's charge with net charge, which is protons minus electrons. It's either negative, 0, or positive. It's negative when there's more E than P, 0 when P and E are equal, and positive when there's more P than E. Likewise, based upon these net charge values, that tells us whether or not our atom is an ion or a neutral atom. In other words, if there's an equal number of protons and electrons, our atom is a neutral atom. However, if protons and electrons are not equal, either P is greater than E or E is greater than P, we classify our atom as an ion. So if we revisit our atoms from earlier, this one is an ion because its net charge is not 0. This one's also an ion because its net charge is also not 0. And this one is a neutral atom because the net charge is equal to 0. An important thing to mention about analogies is they are great models of comparison to use a real-world scenario to understand an academic topic. However, they're not 100% translatable. For instance, positive in soccer means good, but a proton being positive doesn't make it better or worse than a negative electron.